Flowing right into the meta panel. So yeah, what is MetaFest without the meta day? So after all of these days of digging into technology and the tooling and the DeFi, refi, NFTs, DAOs, and all that ground stuff, building stuff. So yeah, we need a day to zoom out a bit and talk about the bigger picture a bit more. And that's what the meta day has been all about, and that's what the meta panel is all about. So welcome Vinay, welcome Josh, and Brent. I don't need to welcome you because you've been here for the past half hour, but I'm glad you're still here. And yeah, welcome everyone.
Hey, how's it going?
Going good.
MetaFest 2 is still going. This is the 13th day.
Day 13.
Wow. Your stamina
13.
is
Holy
inspiring.
Do you have
This
anything
makes
more?
it sound like there is stamina left.
Do you have anything more to add, Uni, before we get into the questions?
Not really. I think the last point we've been discussing with Brent was a really good segue to this panel.
Yeah.
Indeed, I have a lot of thoughts.
All right, let's do this thing.
Let's do it. You have a lot of thoughts. Is there something you want to share right away?
It's how quickly we want to get political, but I mean, I resonated with a lot of what Brent said in his talk. I really enjoyed it. I haven't read too much about metamodernism, but it is something that is like on my long list of things that I would like to read more into, and people have recommended it to me before, so maybe that'll push me to read a little bit more into it. But yeah, I mean, well, just to answer your question about me not being on Rev Left is because, well, I don't really get asked, to be honest, by these types of more institutionalized left-wing media channels. They just, yeah, I think part of it is, of course, like I'm pseudo-anonymous, so like I think that they probably don't take me seriously in that way. And like I think there's this fear of maybe, and I'm totally speculating, I really don't know, but I'm speculating that I imagine like we would, I don't know, that it challenges them in ways that they can't really come up with easy rebuttals to, besides what they say already on Jacobin or on Twitter or whatever else. So I think for them to talk to me in a like discursive way or like in a kind of debate type of way, it would probably, they feel involved that they would have to learn more about this stuff, which they don't really want to do. That's my guess.
I want to respond to that because I think all that's true. Those are good observations, and it's kind of the same is true about metamodernism because, and it was Left Reckoning that that I mentioned, but Rev Left Radio mentioned metamodernism once, which is why I covered that in my piece. But like, I've not talked to David Griscom and Matt Leck either, and they've not talked about metamodernism. Michael Brooks did, or he was starting to before he passed away. But just what you said about broaching topics that are too complex, and need all this literacy, or that, like in the case of blockchain, like it maybe opens a can of worms. I think that's accurate. I don't think it's a good excuse for them. Like I do think they should talk to you and vice versa. But without completely fleshing it out, it could kind of send the wrong idea too. Like imagine if like Majority Report, like if they're committed to a kind of critical line on this stuff, and then they have a nuanced discussion about it, that could kind of open the door to reactionaries and moderates kind of wanting to push it through, and then the progressive aims not being achieved through those things, which is why like it's always good to bring it back to more grounded political commentary and action
Yeah. No, indeed. I mean, I
Always so
think that
political.
that's definitely something that I would like to do. Like, I always tell them that I'm open to speak to them, whatever. But, I mean, just to give like the example of, I believe it was Dave Griscom and as well Matt Binder. I mean, just because I think the left is also very, or a particular part of the left is very like addicted to Twitter. I think, or like addicted to social media a bit, and so it's I think especially the way that Twitter is designed, like things have to be, like to fit everything you want to say in a tweet, it has to be like super punchy. So it comes off kind of almost offensively as well, like when people talk on Twitter via tweets. So like I've only had like slightly antagonistic like arguments with them where we're just like talking past each other. Like it's never about, it's not on Twitter, it's, you know, it's never about like having really a discussion, or I mean it can be in some situations, but it's pretty rare. And so it sort of defaults on this sort of anger.
Yeah,
angry,
I want to really quickly mention the Modern Monetary Theory folks on Twitter and the Superstructure podcast, because they're very critical of crypto, and and I think if you get on their bad side, which is easy to do, you know, there's no grounds for a conversation or for solidarity. And I think they I think they should be a little bit less harsh sometimes if there's opportunity. Like on their podcast, they have interviewed Matt Chrisman and Daniel Bessner, but then they just dunk on those guys later on Twitter to say like, oh, they're not part of our left, like they're not, you know. And but I think the MMT conversation is so important, because when we talk about cryptocurrencies, we're talking about money, and MMT is about money, and they have a critique of cryptocurrencies and economy. And so that conversation has to happen and come full circle, and without circling the drain. You know, the MMT left and the small fledgling crypto left need to figure out their alliance. I'll just say.
But you know, I got to tell you, right? as a you know half Indian, half Scottish political radical, all of this stuff is totally irrelevant bullshit in the political environment that we're in. Right? It's 50 Celsius in Indian cities that were robbed blind by the English 100 years ago, 45 trillion of assets left, something like $35,000 per Indian, and now they're in cities without running water in 50 Celsius temperatures. And nobody takes this shit seriously. The white left, the white right, the white greens, the white anybody, nobody gives a fuck. And at that point, how can you expect us to take any of this bullshit seriously or care about the fine distinctions? Because all of the Western political movements are 100% for genocide, because they're doing nothing to prevent it, while their civilization enriches itself on the murder of entire ecosystems, including the humans that live in them. You all need to grow the fuck up and stop worrying so much about what each other think. Tell me what you're doing to stop the genocide of the rest of the goddamn world.
It takes collective action, though. Like it's going to be embarrassing if each of us individually try to trot out what we're doing. Like
there's no collective
growing.
action faction. There isn't a white faction that says the first thing we're going to do is we're going to stop the genocide. We're going to take such radical action on climate that we will not be responsible for the deaths of hundreds of millions of people over the next 20 years. There's no political party that says that. Not even the Green parties say that.
Well, I mean, I think they
they don't. No commitments. Nobody
right.
frames
the
climate
UN
crisis as being we will not participate in a genocide. Right?
Yeah, but
literally,
how would we opt out of it when it's a systemic thing that states and corporations are doing? Like I'm trying.
It's not states and corporations. It's the Western middle classes. Right? It's 2-car garages and uninsulated houses and an all-beat diet and all these other things that we enjoy, right? You know, this is not something where 15 evil people are ruining the world for their own benefit. The top 10% of Americans have a CO2 consumption of 70 tons per person. Sustainable is maybe 2 tons per person, right? So what I want to basically suggest here is that the Overton window of Western acceptable political debate is confined within kind of 5 inches of let's all have an enormous genocide because we're not going to change our lifestyles. And if a couple of 100 million Africans, Indians, South Americans boil to death, you know, that's the price of doing business, right? And then you get over here to where people are like, hey, maybe we should not commit genocide. And everybody's like, that would be really hard. And then that's where the political discourse ends. We could never get people to vote for not having a genocide. That's really difficult. All right then, right? Because, this is what happens when you wind up with Western liberals talking to Western liberals about Western liberalism, right? Ongoing genocide makes what the Nazis did look like a pop gun. Might be on the scale of Stalin. We could be talking about 100 million fatalities any given Sunday. A process could start that would result in that. Everybody is screaming about a massive food price panic this year, right? And if that starts, we could see failed states right, left, and center, because once people are short of food, that's when the real political mayhem begins. So, I just want to really ground this in, there is a much, much bigger problem than the stuff inside of Western democracies. And even the political radicals inside of Western democracies are still, by my standards, fascist. Right, has that opened up a little space?
Definitely open it up.
It definitely does.
The first question.
A lot of space.
Right? Yeah, and I mean, I'm taking an extreme position here just to kind of make that space, right? My actual position is maybe 10% more extreme than that, but
I've got no problem with your the language that you use, like calling it genocide. Like if I was to call that hyperbole, you might push back and be offended, but like
it's not like any white people are going to die of climate change.
No, but like, so I mean, I like it when somebody's more critical than I am and uses that language, but like climate change is very abstract, right? So the so-called genocide,
50 Celsius in Indian cities is not abstract.
Okay. Listen, when I say something's abstract, like it's also concrete. Like it doesn't mean it's not concrete, but the discourse is abstracted. Our awareness of it is very abstract. Like
I mean, look, in the same way that the discourse of German civilians in the Holocaust was very abstracted.
Yeah.
Nobody really wanted to know where those trains were going, and they weren't going to do anything to stop them. That would be like dangerous.
Yeah. I mean, I'm making a similar point, but like climate change is like much more abstract because it's
it's only abstract if it's not 50 Celsius outside. Once it's 50 Celsius outside, it's not abstract. Once your agricultural land blows away in the wind, it's not abstract. Climate change is abstract for Western liberals that live in cool climates. And by the way,
the reason you're here.
Oh yes, please.
I think maybe you're using the same word, abstract, but I think you're not meaning the same thing here. And this is the point of this disconnect. I'm not sure. I think that you, Vinay, are using the word abstract in a more every day-to-day way, but you, Brent, have a very more nuanced notion of abstract. So I don't think you're really talking about the different thing, or that there's such a big difference in values here. I think that just Vinay is trying to bring to surface this issue of regionality. For example, I was not born or do not live in any Anglo-Saxon country. I'm not in Australia. I'm not in America. Not the US. Not Canada. I mean, I'm motherfucking Greece, where the 50 degrees Celsius, I can feel you. I can also feel it. It's very real for me in that sense. But I wouldn't say that Brent is not realizing that also. So if Brent, you can speak more to what you want to get at, it would be more useful here, I think.
Yeah. I'm trying to. There's a number of ways. So in one sense, it's abstract in that it's seemingly far removed from people's daily concerns, and that's in agreement with what Vinay is saying about versus vis-a-vis the Western liberals. India is a far off place, and especially like India is a very complex country, and from a Western liberal perspective, you just sort of homogenize it all, and it's all brown people over there, right? So there's that sense, and also, but just climate change being a complex intersection of factors, and also the solutions to it not being a direct kind of convergence, like or correlation, like, oh, if we do this, we'll solve the problem. Like, it's very complex, and also it's, even though, you know, fossil fuel companies and the middle class as an agent, you know, do directly contribute to it. That, when I say direct, that's mediated through so many layers of abstraction and so many objects in the supply chain and so many, you know, functions of our social relations as a society. And I mentioned Paris Marx before. You know, he wrote an article, I think, or I think I might have covered it, but he used the phrase abstraction about climate change, how it's obfuscated. And I think I wrote about the abstraction of climate change. And so, you know, and also, you know, Bill Clinton used that phrase, not that he's right, you know, he's a liberal, but there's a funny interview clip from a Leonardo DiCaprio documentary. Leo's like, why don't you think people get it? And Bill Clinton's like, well, you know, climate change is very abstract. Like, so there's a number of ways it can be.
But look,
meant
this is
there.
like saying the Holocaust was abstract. It's just a way of people hiding from the fact that they're taking no moral responsibility while the civilization.
And I agree. I would agree with that. Like World War II and the Holocaust.
How do I take it remotely seriously when we've got things like metamodernism, which have no stance on genocide prevention as a critical political priority in these times? How am I supposed to respect it in any way, shape, or form if it has no clear and coherent commitment to getting Western CO2 consumption down to the point where you don't kill 20, 30, 50 million Indians a year? Because that's where we're headed.
Yeah.
Right? Because if it doesn't have that commitment, it's just another fascist party.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think for myself, at least, my version is committed to that, you know, explicitly and also implicitly. I think if you pushed other metamodernists, they would concede some territory to that agenda.
Yeah, I tried that. That didn't go so well.
Yeah, you and me both. But you know, you can critique this if you will, but like for me, the Green New Deal is at least one sort of platform proposal. It's very radical in its ambition to kind of consider all of these factors, right? So job security being tied up with like the ecocide and racism and genocide, so there's the American Green New Deal promoted a couple years ago, but also the UN Green New Deal in 2009. So just to contextualize that, the UN is like deeply underfunded, deeply corrupt on different levels, but I think there's good people and good intentions in it. And I think we need a new kind of global governance infrastructure or metastructure or whatever to deal with this. But my point is just like, let's say the UN Green New Deal is the solution and is the anticipation of the genocide Vinay is talking about. It's so ambitious that it's politically dead in the water, you know, that it's ignored, that it's neutralized, right? And so this is why my metamodernism sticks to that radicalism, to say like, there's like, if there is one true proposal, and it'd be open-ended, you know, and flexible somewhat, but ambitious, like, you know, and the phrase has been used even by people like Bill Gates, like, we need a Manhattan Project for energy. Like, of course we do, but politically that needs to be enshrined in a Green New Deal that is like super concerned about people's health and well-being and their relationship to the environment and society.
Maybe.
Yeah, but if I can just add that, I think that this feeling of, at least my perception is that the issue about climate change and people thinking about it and prioritizing why it's difficult as far as like when I think of, or when a normal person, you know, average person talks about their material conditions, they're thinking about how am I going to, you know, reach the expectations that I have to have enough food, to pay for rent, to do all these things. And in a context especially, if you just take the US, but a lot of all the West in general, expectations have been set in certain type of way due to sort of like compiled injustices that have happened over centuries due to colonialism, due to everything else. And so I think, yeah, this is also sort of abstraction and sense of like perception of time, that we don't really perceive climate change happening, right now in my immediate material needs. That's, how can I really, like, if, I'm sure plenty of us have climate anxiety, but like, I became a vegetarian, but I have no idea, because of climate anxiety, but I don't think that me becoming vegetarian does, a single actual thing to fix the issue of climate change, right? It's just something that I do to make myself feel a little bit better about it. And maybe that's like a Christian type of based guilt or something like that. But, it helps me, and it helps me like live to, perhaps do something else that create some sort of greater climate action. But indeed, like, there isn't really at the moment a like coherent like group to sort of, the anti climate genocide group, and I think because of this abstraction, I think abstraction can also mean kind of like big in a certain way. Like it's such a big in scale issue that we need a big and abstract coordination mechanism or group, or that can sort of attack that also abstract problem, which on the left usually we call this systemic, rather but to say abstract, I think.
Yeah, that word systemic, like immediately the image of Andrew Sullivan on The Problem with Jon Stewart going, systems? What are these systems? What are you talking about? And it's so fucking absurd. It's like, Google it, Sully, like, and then we're talking about racism, systemic racism. And that's the irony, Vinay knows this, but the Game B systems thinkers, his eyes go wide.
The reaction,
right? It's like,
whoa.
they, how do you not get that we live in social systems and that these things are connected and that they're abstract? That's the blockchain socialist is saying.
Give me a sec. I'm just going to fetch my emotional support machete. Yeah, I mean, the Game B thing, it's literally just white power in a nice dress, right? It's white power in a fucking kaftan. The conversations have been had, the behaviors have been evidenced, we know who these people are. Fortunately, they're totally irrelevant.
Let's hope so. I mean, they still have more followers, for however you want to measure influence, and they have more capital. Despite our attempted intervention 2 years ago, they keep putting out, whitewash after whitewash, like documentaries.
This thing where you saw the recent one where they had like, I want to say, was it South American or was it African? Some little video game where they had this like, look, here's our Game B Wakanda. Look, all these people are black. That means we're not racists.
Yeah.
They're going to continue to churn this stuff out, but it's in the same domain as like, Marie Antoinette used to have a sheep set up, right? She had a little cottage and there were some sheep and all the rest of it. And she would go there and she would play shepherdess. And before she would go over there, they would wash all the sheep with lavender soap, lambs with lavender soap, and then they would fluff them up and kind of, blow dry them and print them. And, like, that was what Marie Antoinette thought a sheep was. Of course the peasants are working very hard. Look, they're taking care of their sheep. See how white and fluffy they are. And, this is the relationship with the reality that Game B has. Right? If you put those guys in any bottom 2% neighborhood in America economically, and ask them to walk, 2 kilometers down the street and buy a hamburger, 2/3 of them would be dead by the time they go to the hamburger, right? I mean, these people are roadkill culturally, and they can be safely ignored in the same way that we largely ignore catwalk fashion, right? It's just a bunch of rich people in some kind of complex circle jerk, and it doesn't really matter that they continue to get funded to produce the propaganda. Nobody with any brains is paying any attention to it, right? It's just nonsense. To misuse the phrase, right? They aren't even wrong. So, what I want to kind of focus attention on here for a second is there's a lot of work happening in the blockchain right now around regenerative finance, refi. Right? And refi is pretty nebulously defined. It's inherited a lot of DNA from Solarpunk. it's also inherited a lot of DNA from the kind of neoliberal approach to climate, which is we're going to buy offset for everything, and it can be economies. And the result, they're pretty technically sophisticated. They've got decent education on climate. They're pretty good at marketing. You don't look at these projects and think this is immediately going to save the world, but they're certainly more constructive than the vast majority of either charities or companies which say they exist to do environmental stuff. So I think there's quite a promising community forming around refi. And part of the way that they've managed that is that they've settled on a kind of, green market economics plus fabulous hippie values kind of a vibe. And it seems to be growing pretty well, and it seems like it's got the potential for being reasonably healthy. So I think it might be worth saying, look, I think refi is really a good place for people that have these values to set up shop. I think it makes a lot more sense than trying to save a lot of the things that people are fighting for right now. I think it's actually kind of a fresh start, and I think a lot of quite decent things have gone into it. And it does carry with it some of the cultural baggage of the blockchain and some of the cultural blindness of solarpunk and all the rest of that. It's got a little bit of this and that around the edges. But, in spite of the fact that the sauces are a little strange, the actual meat of the thing is actually pretty good. So maybe it'd be worth thinking a wee bit about, that kind of refi thing in the available time that we've got. What do you think of that as a topic? Anybody get any thoughts on refi?
Sure. I mean, I not just, maybe like a month or so ago, was at the Refi Unconference, which was an event held by the Crypto Commons Association and those guys. So I did meet a few people who were in refi. It wasn't like the I don't know. I feel like a lot of the refi people are in America, but it was pretty interesting to hear from them. I do think that, at least more in terms of my observations, when it comes to how crypto has a bit, say, co-opted solarpunk, I think part of it, maybe my critique, it might be generally of kind of my critique of a lot of anarchist movements, but it feels, when I hear it from crypto, it feels just more like an aesthetic than it feels like much else. Whereas like the real, the original quote unquote solarpunk is like a anti-capitalist, eco-anarchist, eco-socialist word. Like that's where it originally came from. That was what it is. But like, at least in like online communities, if someone were to mention solarpunk in the context of Ethereum or something like that, they would tell you to shut up. They're not going to take it in these online communities. So there is a bit of, I think.
I mean, that sort of happened after we got a whole bunch of entryists left invaded solarpunk. So there was a pre-leftist invasion solarpunk, which was dramatically open to discussions about technology, market mechanisms. They were kind of proper anarchists. And then there was probably 2 years of online conflict as we got increasingly doctrinaire left folks just invading the space until they'd completely co-opted it and ruined it as any kind of space that had a future. They literally just kept swarming on top of the thing until the ship sank as a cultural force. That's why solarpunk is dead.
Well, I mean, I don't know. I would be interested to. I would have to look more into the history behind the use of the word solarpunk. But my understanding is that it was originally an anarchist term or an anarchist thing.
It was initially very heavily anarchist. So
which is an anti-capitalist. I mean, if we're talking about real anarchism, we're talking about anti-capitalism.
Well, it depends who you ask, right? I mean, if you look at I would say that the Spanish anarcho-syndicalists.
They're anti-capitalist.
Well, but they were also reliant on market infrastructure, and they operated things
like corporations. Though. That's not capitalism.
Well, here we get into what does it mean when we say it's a duck, right? But that form of solarpunk, right? There was a single Facebook group. It was called Solarpunk. It basically got increasingly huge amounts of political conflict until the administrators burned out, and then the administrators passed the admin rights to a bunch of the entryist left folks. And the entryist left folks basically turned it into the same old doctrinaire shenanigans. Then anarchist solarpunk split off, and maybe one or two other solarpunks kind of split off. And then the movement basically balkanized around left and right political lines as each identifiable political faction made their own version of solarpunk, and solarpunk as a uniting force died. That was the end of it.
But then again, I think that sort of shows that, like, X-punk, whatever, a lot of the times these are just sort of aesthetics. like the reason why you were so easily divided by left and right or whatever it was probably means that it was just aesthetics from the get-go.
Well, I mean, aesthetics, but also political economy, right? So if we say the food comes out of the ground and it's eaten by the people that grow it plus their friends, and the energy comes from water wheels, windmills, and solar panels, and there is no electrical grid and the internet is all mesh networks and satellite, at that point, you may have a left version of that story and a right version of that story, but the industrial base that shapes society, the material conditions, are solar punk material conditions with political variations within that, right? Once you decide that solar punk is being kind of pulled backwards and forwards within the, Marxist industrialist left-right axis, then at that point it's kind of hard to talk about this thing from a proper anarchist perspective. It's a very delicate thing to talk about what happens when we change the material conditions, and then we look at the politics after that. Because all of the politics, the bedrock of so much of this politics, even the Spanish anarcho-syndicalism, is that wealth is generated in factories rather than either agriculture or intellectual work, right? So, there's a very complicated and entangled knot there. And there are more solutions to that than every faction gets their own version of solar punk, right? I mean, that is not really the answer that we wanted out of that. We wanted collective thinking about the material base of society rather than an attempt to split up that vision and for every political faction to then build their own little sandcastle.
I think this is exactly it. Like, but when you say material conditions without politics, that's still just it. Like that, all I'm imagining is just a picture of someone, with their community garden and like, using certain things. If we're not talking about politics, and we're not talking about, we're really not talking about the social production of the material conditions that we're trying to create that are largely represented through imagery of, whatever solar punk is, whatever punk is.
Absolutely. Look, this is where it gets complicated, right? This is all the Latour stuff and, science and technology studies and all the rest of that malarkey. Where you put your collective investment shapes the space of technological possibilities that you have to then live inside of, et cetera, et cetera. So in the refi space, right, what we've seen is a kind of shucking off of a lot of the political complexity and the good old-fashioned worship of making some goddamn tokens and then selling them to people, right? There is a sense in which they've rolled up their sleeves and put it to work because the refi people are trying to spin themselves up as the next hot thing in crypto. And with a little bit of luck, that will result in a bunch of greens making a ton of money, and maybe I'll even be one of them. That process, right, what I want to kind of highlight here is that because there is a unifying effort to make a pile of money and to build big running systems that actually do stuff, right? There is a performance of capitalism in one form or another inside of the refi space. In some ways, that constrains what they can do because it's kind of hard to have an anti-capitalist token project. It's not impossible, it can be done, but it's real hard work. But it also means that they are forced to be productive in a way that solarpunk was never forced to be productive, resulting in a staggering amount of internecine conflict and very little actual activity, right? Solarpunk never had really access to capital. They didn't really do very well in terms of social cohesion. They weren't very good at getting collective action, not from any of the factions. There are no solarpunk research villages established as far as I know. Not a lot has gotten done. There is no solarpunk feature film. There is no Netflix special, right? There is no 10-part Netflix series starring, a few famous people. Oh, look, it's the solarpunk show. None of that stuff has happened because solarpunk has failed to really make a mark in the world. The refi thing, I think, is basically the opportunity for a relatively politically superficial but intensely practical version of solarpunk to get another crack at this, right? It's not at all infeasible that the refi movement could finance villages where we go and integrate a whole bunch of the existing technology into ultra-low-cost, high-quality lifestyles. Somebody figure out what fully automated luxury communism looks like in a solarpunk environment. Okay, maybe we can do that out of a refi budget. So I just want to point it out as a really interesting piece of territory and landscape. I think it'd be worth people that have good politics getting involved in the refi movement, helping them see the world in new ways, opening up some additional options. You're not going to change the soul of the machine. These people are still doing this because they want to make a living and they want to take the capital and the blockchain and use it to save the world. It's still in some sense a performance of capitalism. But I think it's in an environment where a little bit of really high quality intellectual input could result in much better, grounded, and much more interesting projects. I think it's a really good scene for people to check out, and I think it's relatively easy to steer into righteous pathways now because it's still relatively young, but you have to accept they're not going to become anti-capitalist in the process in a hurry.
Sure, yeah. I think what I will say is that what was interesting about at least my experience at the conference, which I filmed for my documentary, so Solar Punk will make a it'll make an appearance.
Nice. Oh, excellent.
But there were a lot of people. There were a lot of actually climate scientists at specifically the conference that I was at least. I don't know if that's the norm at other refi conferences. So there was a lot of skeptics in the conference. So there was like this interesting. But I think the Crypto Commons Association specifically is like it attracts more left-leaning and kind of skeptical, open to discussion type of people. So that's kind of why. But indeed, like the difference between, and what maybe my meta critique of the left is that like by relying so much on social media or whatever else, like the only thing that we could do was send messages to each other, and we could have. I mean, you do organize over these tech platforms and through messaging and whatever else, but the introduction of a distributed ledger, it changes the game a bit in the sense that you can start to impart value, or you can begin to share value with each other in particular ways, and with very interesting mechanisms. So like you were able, because they are attracting real money in refi versus just like internet points on Solarpunk forums or whatever. There is an increase in materiality in which you are actually engaging in this movement and climate action.
Yeah, I mean that's kind of it in a nutshell, right? It's a thing that might actually do stuff, and that matters, right? That really matters.
I'm curious if Brent has looked much into refi.
This
So
is the
very
first I've got to look into it. I will just make a quick point about what was said about 5-10 minutes ago about like aesthetics and political economy. Like those are both things that is, but doesn't do a very good job at talking about them together, right? Like I think the discourse on political economy writ large is quite fascinating, and aesthetics less so, but there's a lot to talk about, right? With different cinema, pop culture, and like we're saying with solar punk, like it's an aesthetic. It maps to a kind of lifestyle and a kind of industry without necessarily a clear path, and that's what we're trying to synthesize. That's the kind of liminal edge, so to speak, of like where does political economy and aesthetics actually intersect in a healthy way, and on what timeline, because historicity is a key theme in metamodernism, and that's what we're living through, like this convergence of histories, the revisionism and historicizing about history. And it makes me think about like the UN. The UN, has said we have kind of 2030 as a deadline to have a kind of global ambitious kind of program to cope with climate change and to scale down our pollution and all that. Interestingly, some sources speculate technology and with AI that popularity will come around 2029. So we have like this shrinking window, right? That's 7 years from this year, from now, to kind of like if both these timeframes are true, to kind of achieve a paradigm shift, and we're all like constructively disagreeing or agreeing, but like the discourse out there, it's incredibly messy, it's incredibly regressive and counterproductive, and often co-opted and dominated by right-wingers who are just making shit up in order to muckrake, in order to gain power. This is the shrinking window we live in. And yeah, I'm just sort of rambling now, but this political economy and aesthetics are kind of the ultimate question, I think.
Yeah, there's definitely this assumed distinction between aesthetics and action. Like there's what's actually happens materially, this is the substance of the thing, and the aesthetics that are like a superficial kind of surface level thing that doesn't have an effect on that, which is not really true. It's a very simplistic, kind of very old school, very obsolete distinction, especially in an internet age where memes can move the world. Where we've seen it happen time and time again. And I mean, how many people got into actually engaging with, let's say, socialist literature, or doing a favor to themselves and reading some Naomi Klein just because they were punk when they were a teenager and because it was cool? Aesthetics matter. And memes matter, I would say. And so we can weaponize memes to actually have political praxis. And Solarpunk, I think, is starting to have this status of a weaponized memes that we can use. And weaponize sounds a little bit intimidating.
Instrumentalize. Let's
term, yeah. But still, to use it in a way to infiltrate the public consciousness and to make these things cool and to have like this whole cultural sphere that somebody can get into and follow, and this can act then as a place where they can be exposed to all this stuff that's actually happening in ReFi, that is actually happening with regenerative action and local action and this ultra globalization movement that is going on. That is also maybe very important to also mention when we're talking about, not just talk about Game B, which doesn't have any historical situationality, like it is not rooted in any historical framework rather than maybe American politics, which is a fair criticism. But yeah, well, let's bring back, let's seize the memes of production, let's say.
Yeah, I mean, if Game B is anything, it's American, what do they call it? American pragmatism? It's like some kind of utopian variation of American pragmatism.
American pragmatism is deep, though. Like the philosophical tradition, it's very deep.
Yeah. And Game B is not very deep. But if it's anything, if it has any root, that's where its root is. But yeah, I absolutely agree. American pragmatism is a real thing.
Well, it's American exceptionalist, too, if that's what you're gesturing at. Like that it's, and it's libertarian, obviously, but exceptionalism is that kind of attitude that we're the best or that we're different, and you certainly get that vibe from the core individuals of Game B.
We lost Brent.
Yeah, he disappeared also for a moment.
He reappeared.
Yeah, I can still see him.
Right,
I still have Brent.
You're here now.
Moving.
Yeah.
You cut off at the last 10 seconds, Brent.
Oh, my audio cut off? Oh,
yeah.
Sorry. Oh, I was just saying we certainly see the vibe from the Game B leaders that they're kind of American exceptionalists. Like, not like if you pushed them on it, they'd probably give some waffling answer about decentralization, right? How we want African villages to do their own version of Game B, but their lens to view the world, I think, is connected to this American exceptionalism, which says that America is unique, which it's not really, and that it's the best, which it's not really.
Right. All right. I want to bring it back to out of Game B and into like, we got 15 minutes left. So how do we get out of this mess? How do we stop the genocide, as Vinay would put it?
Well, I mean, it's too late to stop it, right? It's been running very successfully since, I don't know, World War II, before World War II, pick your window, right? 10 million people a year starve to death in a world that produces 50% more food than it would take to feed the entire human race. You know, the ongoing economic genocide has run for your entire life, my entire life. It's been a continuous process. At some point, the world was rich enough that we could have chosen to stop it, and we just didn't. Right? Same thing is true of tobacco. Tobacco kills, I don't know, 10, 20% of Americans die of tobacco-related disease. This stuff is still legal. You think guns kill a lot of people? Wait till you see cigarettes. So, we have to kind of struggle with this collectively as a culture, that there are enormous sources of unnecessary death for which there is no political will to put up any kind of organized resistance. We've got a set of topics that we're willing to shed endless amounts of energy complaining about, and then there are topics which kill 100 times as many people that nobody ever talks about in public. And I think we've got to address that, right? This mechanism that we have where we just don't really want to talk about, like, tobacco and starvation. This is where the dying is really happening. Tobacco and starvation, that's the bad thing. Because we don't really want to engage with that, it's very hard for us to build an evidence-based politics. It's very hard for us to describe ourselves as realists. Each faction decides what part of the world they're willing to deal with and what part of the world they're willing to ignore. And then any bad thing that happens in the thing they're ignoring, neither left nor right in America will make any coordinated stance against tobacco. They're all for drug control, apart from the drug that does all the actual killing. So I think that we've got to start by saying, what does it look like to actually deal with the problems that really exist, rather than the problems which are acceptable to one political faction or another political faction? We've got to get to some kind of grounded reality about where the dying is happening and what we should do to stop it. I'm also really great fun at children's parties, by the way. I'm just fantastic.
Vinay. Sorry.
Great. Well, I was going to add that, I think that's right. The reason why we have not stopped it, I think, is not, I don't think it's particularly helpful to think of it. I don't know if that's necessarily what you meant, but to think of it as we just chose not to. The people in the past just chose not to fix problems. I think it's more about a social reproduction of a particular system that prioritizes particular outcomes. And, I call that capitalism, and it's one that is essentially marching us to death by extracting resources out of the earth for profits, for whatever else. And we're sort of stuck in that loop, and we're stuck in these types of social relations that are just very, very deeply embedded, not just in ourselves, but in the institutions in which we are born into. And so we can't, when we're children, you're just given the reality of the world, and you're sort of told to figure it out. And, the assumption when you're born is just that's the world is a neutral place in which, we'll sort of exist in. But then over time, I think there is this abstraction where I think we have not, a lot of people have not, or they have realized but don't know how to react to the fact that we live in a particularly different time than we have ever existed before. And so all of these things that we sort of took for granted, or that are deeply embedded as things to be taken for granted by people generations before us, who could not possibly fathom a type of world that we live in today, we're struggling to sort of figure out what to do with that. And so I think there is this sort of revisionism of history as well, where these political lines of left versus right, that oh well, what the right tried this and the left tried that and they both sucked, and now we just got to go like this other different way this third way that I've like sort of figured out on my own, like follow me, that sort of transcends left and right. But I think it's sort of an overly simplistic understanding of what happened in history, and I think we have to acknowledge like we want to talk about genocide, but like we have to, I think, as well talk about like the intentional killings of of communists, of socialists, of various stripes by fascist forces. I mean, I recommend the book The Jakarta Method. I mean, the systemic killing of left wingers in third world countries, with the support of the United States.
Yeah, you bet.
I
mean, 50 years of targeted assassination of left-wing leaders in Africa and South America, for sure. Yeah.
And there is nothing, even close to the extent of death of like, because I'm waiting for some right winger to say, oh, well, the left kills right wingers all the time with their transgender ideology or whatever. Like there's nothing even close to the amount of killing of the left by the right in world history.
Right, other than the killing of the left by the other left. That's where the real big death toll is, right? I mean,
I think it still pales in comparison.
Stalin and
from the right.
Stalin and Mao do not pale in comparison to anything, right? I mean, I really know my genocides. Let me tell you, Stalin and Mao, they pale in comparison to nothing.
Yeah.
Not to split hairs, but how much of that was due to famine and malnutrition, right?
We are not going down exactly what happened in Russia and China in the 10 minutes we've got left on this call.
Right.
There's no point in going there, right? So
the only point I would make is kind of the backdrop of the political economy of war behind all of it, and that's not to oversimplify either, right? Oligarchs control both parties. Of course they do, but one's more militaristic. But it's that political economy of war definitely is a factor in the Cold War and in these genocides.
Oh, sure.
And that includes
war's real profitable for some factions in the American machine, no doubt, right?
And that factors into all the ways,
including.
Oh, whoever that was, try it again, including something.
Sorry, my webcam. That includes all the ways to kill people, including famine.
Maybe, right? I mean, so I want to make a shout here for a thing called Prout. Anybody heard of Prout? Okay, so in India, there's a thing called progressive utilization theory. It's a weird political philosophy in that it combines a whole bunch of different elements to produce a theory which is it includes class elements for Marxism, it includes syndicalist elements for anarchism, it includes a whole pile of Indian stuff that is nowhere identifiable in the Western political landscape. It's been kicking around for about 60 years, and there's an organization called Ananda Marga, which is a political and religious movement which exists to teach meditation and also teach this thing called Prout. I think Prout is right now a better model for any future political action than anything that's come out of Europe or America. I think it's just flat out better. I think it's dramatically more realistic and more likely to succeed than anything that's built on the foundation of either Marx or Hayek. And I think it'd be really nice if Western political thinkers started doing the hard reading. You're going to have to learn a little bit of Sanskrit enough that you can figure out what they're calling their social classes. You're going to have to learn a bit of Indian history to figure out how it fits into the world. But I really think it might be time to look outside of the kind of dialectical trap that Europe and America have been stuck in since Marx and seem to be unable to escape regardless of what changes there are in the political economy of the world. I think Prout has dramatically more potential for actually working. And I'd really like it if more people had the kind of basics of Prout literacy, whether they're for it or against it. It'd be really nice if more people understood it. So progressive utilization theory. They've got recent modifications, so they've gotten really into bioregionalism over the past while. It's not a static target. They are learning, they are improving, they're changing things as they go. Never been tried at scale, but it has a fascinating history.
All right, I dropped the link for anybody interested. It's on
Yeah.
Discord.
Lots of interesting stuff back there. So yeah, that's my plug. I think we ought to take a serious re-examination of Prout, because God knows, this left-right thing, neither pole really has any foundation to deal with environmental issues from, because there were no environmental issues when the left and right positions were defined in their essential forms.
I think that's assuming like a very, very concrete idea of what I think the left and right are, when they are like they're very nebulous concepts all the time, and they're just they're heuristics for trying to make a broader point. Which, I mean, when you're talking about politics, when someone says left, you're saying it to someone else, it means like 10 other different things. So I mean, I think it's complicated.
There's also something called the open-closed political spectrum, and I think that's an interesting rabbit hole, because open and closed does, practically map to left and right. That the left is more open and the right's more closed off, but it also has its own implications distinct from that. So we can view it independent of left-right, but also that it tracks with that conventional notion.
Yeah.
There's a question which I'm afraid we don't have enough time for, with 4 minutes left. But the question is, Vinay, could you explain the basics of Prout?
Sure. So the name means progressive utilization theory, right? And the idea is the goal of the political organization of society is to optimally use all of the society's resources for the welfare of human beings and the environment. They start with a very, very radical position on wealth accumulation, and they suggest that people should only be allowed to accumulate massive amounts of wealth if they get a social license, which is equivalent to something like winning an MBE or being appointed to an order of merit. So they think of wealth as being something where somebody can be bestowed the right to accumulate wealth, but if you don't have that right, your tax rate just rises and rises and rises until you hit a limit at some number of dollars. So they start by basically saying wealth caps, but wealth caps which can be risen by community assent. Extremely radical, not likely to happen anytime soon unless the wealth caps are stratospheric. Then in terms of organizing the economy, what they suggest is basically market-free enterprise, basically market capitalism for small businesses. Medium-sized enterprises then automatically convert to being employee-owned. Large enterprises and natural monopolies become operated by the state. In terms of the state, they don't foresee this as happening inside of existing nation-state boundaries. They're much more interested in quite small patch bioregionalism as being the organizational units of society. And then there's a complicated thing about how they see a succession of classes. Militarism tends to result in periods after the militarism where you get intellectualism. Intellectualism, after a while, you tend to get workers' revolts. There's a kind of succession model, a little bit like Marxist class analysis, but distinct from it. And that's really it in a nutshell in terms of the general story. It accepts that there will be markets. And the part of it which I think is uniquely interesting is that it thinks that the structural problems are largely about scale. They don't think it matters very much if a 5-person company runs on capitalist principles. That's not where the damage is being done. By the time you get to 500 employees, they really want employees to be running the company so it doesn't become oppressive. By the time you get to 50,000 employees, the thing is practically part of the government already, so you might as well take it over and have it be democratically run. And I think that as a model potentially fixes a lot of the problems when we try and regulate structures of very different kinds of influence inside of the same political economy. Right? They're very clear that entities at different levels of scale need to be handled really differently. And I think that there's an enormous amount to learn from that in terms of how we start approaching the hard questions around global governance. So that's Prout in a nutshell. I am not as expert in Prout as I ought to be. I mean, the level of understanding that I have is kind of it's about as good as my understanding of libertarianism or communism. There are certainly people that are real scholars that can take you all the way down that rabbit hole, and they're very happy to do so. Consult your local Ananda Marga chapter, and they will Prout you until your sandals fall off.
Right. Is there anybody to follow on Twitter?
There are tons and tons and tons of proud folks on Twitter. An enormous number of them are monks in red robes from this Ananda Marga organization. Ananda Marga, like, I met those guys for the first time in Iceland. I also just ran into a bunch of Hindu monks on the street, like, where did you come from? Oh, we're Ananda Marga. What are you guys up to? Their aid program in Haiti was they taught people how to make concrete water filters so they could make clean drinking water for themselves and their neighbors, and they could run little businesses making drinking water. You know, teaching people how to make the filters, selling the filters, and also karate, because Haiti was a dangerous place and they wanted the people they were helping to have self-defense. And I'm like, how much more pragmatic does it get? You guys are awesome. So it's kind of I have a long-standing love affair with them, although I'm not a member of Ananda Marga. They're just kind of fellow travelers in that great kind of Indian fraternity of people that would like the world to be a better place. And we don't really make much of a distinction between religion, politics, mythology, science, and philosophy. In India, those are all kind of the same field. It's not broken up knowledge in the same way that it is in the West. So when you're looking at this prout stuff, you're going to hit chunks of things. You're like, what is this doing here? And the answer is, hello, welcome to India.
All right. Sounds like an interesting rabbit hole to go down.
I hope you enjoy it. It's nice to see
a
you.
minute over. And thank you. Thank you, all three of you. This was great. I love the panel. And